Yayındayız. Çok teşekkür ediyoruz Sayın Başkansı. İstanbul Sanayi Odası'nın sürdürülebilirlik vizyonu kapsamında gerçekleştirilen İSO Yeşil Gündem Sohbetlerinin ikincisinde sizlerle birlikteyiz. Hoş geldiniz. Bu kez konu başlığımız iklim krizine küresel bakış ve krizleri yönetmek üzerine. Global dünyada tabii ki iklim krizinin sonuçlarını hep birlikte yaşıyoruz. Nedenlerine de hep birlikte aslında nedenlerini de bizler yaratıyoruz diyebiliriz. Doğal afetlerin yanı sıra dünyanın birçok noktasında yaşanan kuraklık, susuzluk gibi birçok konu dünyanın farklı noktalarına da etki ediyor global dünyada. İşte küresel iklim kriziyle ilgili hem global anlamda iklim ayağına hem de ekonomi kısmına ikisinin de küresel etkilerine bakacağız hep beraber. Şöyle diyebiliriz, dünyanın bir noktasında yaşanan susuzluk ya da kuraklık dedik. Örnek vermek gerekirse 2010 yılında Rusya'da kuraklık yaşandığı zaman buğday fiyatları çok yükselmişti. Tüm dünya etkilenmişti bundan. Yine 2009 yılında Brezilya'da şeker pancarı fiyatları yükseldiğinde önemli üreticiler tüm dünyayı yine etkilemişti. Hem ekonomiyi etkilemişti hem de gıdanın üretimini tabii ki insanlara ulaşmasını iki açıdan da. İşte tüm bu konulara küresel anlamda bakacağız. Toplantımızın, panelimizin başlangıcında ise İSO Yönetim Kurulu Başkanı Sayın Erdal Bahçıvan bizlerle birlikte olacak. Ardından da panele geçeceğiz. Çok değerli konuklarım var. Sizlere az sonra onları da tanıtacağım. Sayın İSO Başkanı Erdal Bahçıvan'a sözü bırakıyoruz. Buyurun lütfen. Sanırım seste sorun var, evet.
Evet, tekrar merhaba Ilgaz Hanım, çok teşekkür ediyorum. Değerli katılımcılar, panelimizin çok değerli konuşmacıları, bugün bizimle birlikte olan kıymetli medya mensupları, İstanbul Sanayi Odası Yeşil Gündem Sohbetlerinin ikinci etkinliği olan İklim Değişikliğine Küresel Bakış ve Krizleri Yönetmek panelimize hepiniz hoş geldiniz. Sizleri İstanbul Sanayi Odası adına saygıyla ve sevgiyle selamlıyorum. Son yıllarda küresel ısınma ve iklim değişikliğinin çok acı sonuçlarını yaşıyoruz. Bu nedenle küresel işbirliğinin ve fikir alışverişlerinin en çok da bu temada buluşması gerekliliğine inanmaktayız. Nitelikli ve farklı ufuk açıcı değerlendirmelerin hayatımızda olması hem biz sanayiciler hem de insanlık için son derece önemli. Bugün bu konuda uluslararası uzmanlar ile yapmayı hedeflediğimiz faaliyetlerimizin ilk örneğini alanında yetkin ve çok değerli iki bilim insanıyla birlikte yapmaktan büyük bir mutluluk duyuyoruz. Klimatolog ve Kanada Üniversitesi Öğretim Üyesi Sayın Profesör Gordon McBean ve Dünya Bankası İklim Değişikliği Grubu Baş Ekonomisti Sayın Stefan Hallegatte toplantımıza katıldığınız için sizlere çok teşekkür ediyoruz. Hoş geldiniz. Gerek küresel ısınma ve gerekse bunun ekonomik sonuçları ile ilgili ufkumuzu açacağına inandığım bilimsel görüş ve düşüncelerinizi tüm izleyicilerimiz gibi merakla beklediğimi özellikle ifade etmek istiyorum. Bu vesileyle bugünkü panelimizi yönetecek olan gazeteci Ilgaz Gürsoy'a da teşekkür etmek istiyorum. Çok değerli katılımcılar, panelimize geçmeden önce iklim değişikliği ve sonuçları ile ilgili görüş ve değerlendirmelerimi sizlerle kısaca paylaşmak istiyorum. Son yıllarda yaşadığımız birçok olağanüstü doğa olayı ve felaketler, bilim insanlarının yıllardır altını çizmekte olduğu küresel ısınma ve iklim değişikliğini geleceğe ilişkin muhtemel bir senaryo olmaktan çıkardı. 10 yıllar önce bilim dünyasının adeta çırpınarak dile getirdiği gerçeklerin şiddetini bugün artık çok daha yoğun bir şekilde hissediyoruz. Bilim insanları sera gazı salınımı kısıtlanmazsa önümüzdeki 10 yıllarda yaşanacakları dünyaya şöyle sıralıyorlardı. Dünyadaki yağış düzeni değişecek, ekolojik sistemler tahrip olacak, biyoçeşitlilik azalacak, deniz seviyesi yükselecek, ormansızlaşma artacak, su kaynakları kirlenecek, kuruyacak, sulak alanlar azalacak, dolayısıyla çölleşme başlayacak, toprak kaymaları ve erozyon artacak, kasırgalar ve seller büyük yıkımlara yol açacak, yangınlar önlenemeyecek, tarımsal rekolteler azalacak, iklim göçlerinin önü alınamayacak. Hatırlayalım, 1990'lı yıllarda bunların birçoğu kimi devletler ve liderleri için kurgusal bir geleceğin uydurulmuş senaryolarıydı. Bugün ise dünyamızda artık bu felaketlerin hangisi yaşanmıyor diye sormamız gerekiyor. Son 4-5 yıla ve özellikle de geçirdiğimiz son 1 yıla baktığımızda yıllar önce önümüze konan küresel ısınma faturasının tümünü ne yazık ki aşırı hava olayları, yangınlar, seller, kasırgalar ve daha birçok farklı felaketleri yaşıyoruz. Yaşamsal öneme haiz bu konunun artık toplantı salonlarından çıkarak bireylerin önceliği haline gelmesi gerektiği bir noktadayız. Siyasilerden bilim insanlarına, iş dünyasından sanatçılara kadar iklim değişikliğini konuşmalı, bilime kulak vermeli ve acil önlem alınması gerektiğini de yaymalıyız. Bu zorlu süreç her geçen gün uzak tehditten varoluşsal ve acil bir duruma dönüşüyor. Bugün artık daha sürdürülebilir bir dünya inşa etmek alternatif politika seçeneklerinden biri değil, yaşamı güvence altına almak için tek seçenek olarak önümüzde duruyor. Bu durumda sanayiciler olarak sormamız gereken 2 temel soru var. Dönüşüm nasıl olacak ve bu dönüşüme zamanında cevap verebilecek miyiz? Yaşanmakta olan tüm bu gelişmelere baktığımızda şunu söyleyebilmeliyiz. Kimliklerimiz, ülkelerimiz, aidiyetimiz, varoluş nedenimiz ne olursa olsun üzerinde tartışmasız mutabık kalmamız, birleşmemiz gereken tek şey çocuklarımıza, gençlerimize, gelecek nesillerimize yaşanabilir bir dünya bırakmak olmalıdır. Eğer insanlık olarak dünyamızı bizden sonraki nesillere insani şartlarda yaşanabilir bir gezegen olarak devretmekte samimiysek, üzerinde buluşacağımız yegane nokta bizi bekleyen tüm risklerin ve de tehditlerin farkında olmaktır. Dahası bu konuda bilim dünyasının önümüze koyduğu çözümlere yönelik global mutabakat için asla zaman kaybetmeden harekete geçmek zorundayız. Değerli katılımcılar, sanayicilik üretmekle olduğu kadar toplumsal yaşamın her noktasında tam bir sorumluluk bilinciyle hareket etmekle ilişkili bir meslek anlayışını bizlere veriyor. Bu nedenle yatırım yaparken de, üretirken de nelerin tükettiğimizin bilinciyle hareket etmeyi en önemli ilkemiz ve de politikamız olarak görüyoruz. Sürdürülebilirliği korumanın bu noktada başladığının bilincinde olduğumuzu özellikle vurgulamak istiyorum. İstanbul Sanayi Odası, Türkiye'nin en köklü ve derin kültüre sahip sivil toplum kuruluşlarından biri olarak başta üyelerimiz olmak üzere toplumun tamamında sürdürülebilirlik konusunda farkındalık yaratmak için son yıllarda önemli çalışmalara imza atıyor. Tüm sanayi firmalarını, sanayici mensuplarımızı çok yönlü eğitim programları ve farklı organizasyonlarla gerek yerel, gerekse bugün olduğu gibi global anlamda kaçınılmaz olan bu dönüşüm sürecinin içinde tutmaya çalışıyoruz. Az evvel de söylediğim gibi küresel işbirliğinin ve fikir alışverişlerinin hiçbir konuda olmadığı kadar bu temada buluşması çok çok değerli. Sözlerimi bugünkü toplantımızın bu değerli amaca olumlu bir katkı sunması dileklerimle tamamlarken aramıza çok uzaklardan katılarak etkinliğimize değer katan kıymetli misafirlerimize bir kez daha teşekkür ediyor. Hepinizi bu vesileyle saygıyla ve sevgiyle selamlıyorum.
İstanbul Sanayi Odası Yönetim Kurulu Başkanı Sayın Erdal Bahçıvan'a çok teşekkür ediyoruz. Teşekkürler Sayın Bahçıvan. Konuklarımıza dönelim hemen. Çok kıymetli konuklar Amerika Birleşik Devletleri'nden ve Kanada'dan az sonra İngilizce konuşacaklar. Onun için ben de kısa bir hatırlatma yapayım hemen panele geçmeden önce değerli katılımcılar. Toplantı sırasında simultane tercüme yapılacak. Tercümeyi dinleyebilmek için de ekranın en sağ köşesinde altta yan tarafta bulunan Interpretation kısmından Türkçe tercüme için Turkish kanalını seçmeniz gerekiyor. Sorularınızı da yine ekranın alt kısmında bulunan Q&A'den soru cevap kısmından bizlere iletebilirsiniz. Panelin ardından süremiz el verdiğince sorularınızı da konuklara ileteceğiz. Çok teşekkür ediyoruz. Hemen panele geçiyoruz. Konuklarımız bizi bekliyor. Biz de heyecanla onların anlatacaklarını merak ediyoruz aslında. Profesör Gordon McBean, Klimatolog, Kanada Western Üniversitesi Öğretim Üyesi, klimatoloji üzerine çalışıyor. Aynı zamanda Kanada hükümetinde de danışmanlık görevinde bulundu. Sivil toplum kuruluşlarında da hala çalışmaları devam ediyor. Önemli görevlerde yer alıyor. Bize de kıymetli bilgilerini aktaracak az sonra. Ve hemen diğer konuğuma geçiyorum. Sayın Stephanie Holgate, Dünya Bankası İklim Değişikliği Grubu Baş Ekonomisti. Yaklaşık 10 yıllık akademik araştırmalarının çalışmalarının ardından 2012 yılından bu yana Dünya Bankası'nda çalışıyor, görev alıyor. Doğal afetler, risk yönetimi, iklim değişimine adaptasyon, kentsel politikalar, iklim değişikliğinde sorunları azaltmak ve yeşil büyüme üzerine çalışıyor. Kendisine de teşekkür ediyoruz. Az sonra kendisini de dinleyeceğiz. Profesör Gordon McBean ile hemen başlayalım dilerseniz. Merhaba, hoş geldiniz yayınımıza. Teşekkür ediyoruz. Bu değerli çalışmalarınız için de takip ediyoruz. Size teşekkür ediyoruz. İklim değişikliğinin, buyurun lütfen.
Thank you, and thank you very much for your introductory comments. And I just say that I am very pleased and quite frankly impressed with the comments.
Hemen soruya geçelim dilerseniz. İklim değişikliğinin sonuçlarını azaltmaktan tabii ki bahsediyoruz. Bunun için de kurumsal katılım çok önemli. Özellikle son yıllarda hem sivil toplum örgütlerinin bu konuda çalışmalarını arttı. Tabii kurumların, global markaların da bu konudaki çalışmaları arttı. Tabii sonuçta gelinen noktadaki negatif yapılanları azaltmak üzerine bir çalışma var. Ancak nedenlere de aslında odaklanmak gerekiyor. Bir de adaptasyon süreci var. Çünkü Paris Anlaşması'nda da bu adaptasyon sürecinden bahsediliyor. Temelde aslında iklim krizinin nedenlerini azaltmak ya da elimizden gelirse yok etmek üzerine neler yapabiliriz? Sizi dinliyoruz. Buyurun lütfen.
Well, thank you very much. I think there are actions that can be taken. Just to add to what the chair has already said, we had the September, well, I guess late August 2021 report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which stated very emphatically that it is unequivocal that climate change is happening due to human emissions, and that the global temperature change will continue for at least the next, well, several decades under any emission scenario, and that we should take action though, because the chances of restraining ourselves to 1.5 or 2 degrees C as discussed in the Paris Agreement is, well, basically not possible unless there is very dramatic reductions in emissions already. And again, as the chair said in his opening comments, we are seeing extreme events with the wildfires in Turkey. I'm from Canada. We've got wildfires happening all over our country. We've had hot days. We had tornadoes again the other day, heat waves, and these kind of things are such that we need to take action. And just to say, as the Secretary General of the United Nations said this month earlier, that what he called code red for humanity, that global change warming is really emphatic and we need to take actions. I think the actions need to be looked at both for mitigation, emission reductions, and adaptation from corporations, by governments, etc., to look to see which ones will have the most benefits, both from a point of view of your own corporation, but particularly also for society. There are also the legal and liability disclosure issues. There is an international action, which I've been somewhat part of, in terms of climate change risks disclosure, in which corporations and governments are expected, and maybe under eventual laws be required to indicate what their corporate risks are as we go ahead, and how can you take actions to reduce those corporate risks and do them in a way that there is a benefit for society. And I'd just like to say that it's important not to separate these two issues, adaptation and emission reductions, mitigation, because they do intersect. There are actions you can take which both reduce emissions and reduce the exposure and vulnerability, or combinations of them, to hazardous events. Just quoting the Secretary General of the UN again, this is what he said in January. He said, "If I had to select one sentence to describe the state of the world, I would say that we are a world in which the global challenges are more and more integrated and the responses are more and more fragmented. And if this is not reversed, it's a recipe for disaster." And as the chairman referred to, the Sustainable Development Goals are very important in this dealing with these, because they overlap with and are consistent with the Paris Agreement. There's also the Sendai Framework for Action on Disaster Risk Reduction, which has very explicit actions to be laid out in terms of actions to reduce disaster risk, and hence the impacts of floods and storms and wildfires and earthquakes and those kind of things. And we need to see how this kind of actions can be taken place. I think from a corporate point of view, and I do talk to Canadian companies and occasionally to more international companies, it's important to look at where the actions will take place in terms of a time scale. Is it the benefits of emission reductions are very, very important, but they will not give us benefits in terms of decades to come as they influence the trajectory of global warming, say past 2050 or 2060. The actions on adaptation can provide us with benefits earlier as these extreme events happen, but they will also continue to provide benefits. And the economics, which Stefan will speak to more than me, certainly show that the economic and social benefits of these issues are such that we can have economic benefits as well as social ones. And one of the big issues nationally and globally is the dealing with the impacts on different parts of our populations, our societies. The poorer people, in Canada, our First Nations, Indigenous people are ones that are being more impacted by these kind of climate change events. And we need to take action to make sure that the response strategies we take address these issues across all of societies. And as was announced by the European Union yesterday, and I hope other countries will make similar announcements, major financial support for climate change actions in developing world, particularly emission reductions, but also particularly adaptation, I should have said, where we can take action. So I think, assume I will then stop talking on this question, and then we can go on to the next questions, or we'll go to Stefan. I'm not sure the order, but it's up to you, Chair Lady. You're doing a good job and smiling now, so I guess you're happy with what I've just said. Thank you.
Estağfurullah, tabii ki. Tam vaktinde bitirdiniz zaten. Net olarak aktardığınız bilgileri. Ben Stefan Holgate'e geçiyorum o zaman. Bıraktığımız yerden kendisiyle devam edelim. Tekrar size döneceğiz ardından. Stefan Holgate, Dünya Bankası İklim Değişikliği Grubu baş ekonomisti. Sizin de dediğiniz gibi ekonomi ayağına bakalım. Şimdi dünya ekonomilerine baktığımızda biz refah seviyesini görmek istediğimizde, refah seviyesini kıyasladığımızda gelişmişliği görmek için ekonomi ekonomik büyüme rakamlarına bakıyoruz, gayri safi yurt içi hasılaya bakıyoruz, gelirler karşımıza çıkıyor. Bu rakamlar gerçekten insanların refahını yansıtan göstergeler mi diye soracağım. Çünkü bir taraftan baktığımızda belki bu gelişmişlik düzeyine ulaşırken karbon emisyonu fazla harcanıyor. Belki yenilenebilir enerjiler yeterince kullanılmıyor. Dünyanın doğal kaynaklarından çok fazla kullanılıp tüketiliyor. Aslında yeni kıyaslama için belki de göstergeler var karşımızda. Yani geldiğimiz noktada küresel krizleri yönetmek için bu noktadaki bakış açımız ne olmalı? Buyurun.
Thank you very much, and thank you also for organizing this event. I want to stress the fact that when we discuss those issues, the role of you in the audience will be extremely important. We talk a lot about the environmental impact of economic activity, but we have also to talk about all of the solutions, all of the innovation that industries are bringing to the table, and the importance to have your voice in this debate about what are the right policies and the right measures. To get to your question on the role of economic growth or GDP growth, which is the main way we look at economic progress. And there are a lot of voices today saying that we're just looking too much at GDP growth and we should have a broader view. I think the first point to remember is that GDP growth, in spite of all of the limitation, has played a key role in improving quality of life and reducing poverty in the world. If you look at the countries who have done a great job at reducing poverty, and Turkey is one of them, in most cases, there are countries also that managed to achieve very rapid economic growth. So we see clearly the role of economic growth as lifting people out of poverty, creating good jobs. So I think it's an important factor, it's an important indicator to look at GDP growth. We also know that this is not everything in life, right? We know that quality of life of the population will depend on many other factors. We know that access to services is really important. Are you able to bring your kids to school? Do you have access to electricity, to water, sanitation? We are talking very often of what we call multidimensional poverty, because we know that some people have an income that is high, but because they don't have access to some services, they can also be considered in poverty. Inequality is another one. Societies with very large inequalities have lower quality of life, and people report less happiness and well-being in societies with a lot of inequalities. But here we want to talk about the environment, and environment is another blind spot of GDP and GDP growth. And we know that damages to the environment can damage well-being and increase GDP at the same time. Think of living in a country with a very nice weather, Turkey being one example. If you're losing your nice weather and you have to rely quite a lot on air conditioning because summers are becoming too hot, because air conditioning, the consumption will count in GDP, but all of the pleasure from a nice weather doesn't count in GDP, you might have a situation where you degrade your environment and you increase GDP by doing so, and it doesn't mean that you're happier. So we have to be very careful how we measure things and also look at all of the risks, because in some countries we can see very quick increase in GDP. For instance, let's think of all exporting countries. You might see a very quick growth in GDP, but you have also to take into account that if you're relying on just one commodity, one export market, your growth might be rapid but very fragile, and it can go away. So GDP, very important, but doesn't measure all of what matters for welfare. We have to take into account that some growth patterns are more risky than others. I'm sure we will discuss carbon intensity of the Turkish economy in a minute. And finally, the fact that there are a lot of opportunities of growing GDP and improving welfare and improving the environment. And this is really what we should be focusing on.
Türkiye ile ilgili konulara da dikkat çekeceğim dediniz. Türkiye ile global anlamda bir kıyaslamayı yapabilir miyiz şimdi?
Yes, it is possible. What we are trying not to do is to summarize everything into one number, one ranking, one indicator, because all countries have their successes and things on which they are making less progress. In the case of Turkey, looking at all of the environmental challenges, there are clearly some massive success in the last decades. If you're looking at soil erosion, that was a big issue on which the government has made big efforts in the last few decades. This is a success story with the role of forestry, big investments, and now we see the results on that. If you're looking at the share of renewable energy in electricity production in Turkey, the increase starting from almost zero in 2000 to get to almost 50% today is one of the most rapid I've ever seen anywhere. So we have this big success. We also have challenges, some linked to air pollution in cities, for instance. There has been progress, but more is always needed. And of course, there is this question of what is the long-term perspective? Because one thing to remember when we talk about climate change is that to stop the global temperature from increasing, our objective is to bring global emissions to zero. And I know it sounds a massive challenge, but I want to reassure everybody that we know how we can do that. It's by making sure electricity is completely without carbon, and then using energy efficiency and using this carbon-free electricity in buildings, in transportation, in industry. So we know how we can achieve that, but the road is still very long. And there are a lot of things that need to happen in the energy sector, the building sector, the transport sector. What we're trying to do is to identify solutions which are making progress on the climate perspective, but because it's not the only goal of economic policy, we also are trying to find solutions which are good for the development of Turkey, the development of its industries, job, and poverty. This, I think, is what we should be focusing on, what we can contribute that accelerates economic growth, reduce poverty, and help with our climate challenges.
Tabii sizin de söylediğiniz gibi yerel kalkınma önemli. Yerelden başlayarak adım adım ilerlemek. Teşekkür ediyoruz. Tekrar size döneceğiz verdiğiniz kıymetli bilgiler için. Sayın Gordon McBean'e dönüyoruz. İklim direncinden aslında bahsetmek istiyorum ben. Biraz da daha büyük topluluklarda iklim direnci oluşturmak için ölçeklenebilir çözümler var mı? Bu bağlamda iyi uygulamalar nelerdir? Daha iyisini yapabilmek için bizler, hükümetler neler yapmalı?
Yes, thank you. I think there are scalable solutions. I think they all need to be based on analysis that is done locally, but working together internationally. And just to say that there are international programs, the World Bank is obviously doing things, but there's the Global Adaptation or Global Commission on Adaptation, which puts out reports. They're based in the Netherlands, and they're integrated programs that work globally. One example is the Future Earth Research for Global Sustainability program, which brings together various groups of people from around the world. And the Future Earth program is just under a restructuring process right now, but it has networks of scientists working together. And one of the areas it works on, which I'm involved with, is what they call risk to extreme events, looking at how we can bring together through what's called a knowledge to action networks, different ideas, approaches to dealing with the issues of extreme events happening. Just some general comments. One of the things that we need to work on, and Stefan referred to this also, is the whole question across large communities is the equity, diversity, inclusion process, where we need to work together to bring the benefits to all segments of the population of a very large mega community. In that sense, and just examples we've been working on in projects I've been involved with in Canada and working globally, is we need to, first of all, look at the do an assessment of the adverse risks that will happen most dramatically in the area we're talking about. If we're talking about a particular community along the coast of the Mediterranean Sea or somewhere, or the oceans, there are big issues of sea level rise, more storms with storm surges. So we need to really look at coastal issues. We also need to look at the issues of riverine flooding of rivers in cities, again, communities that are, as many are, based on rivers. I had a research project a few years ago where we worked together with scientific groups in Bangkok, Manila, and Lagos, Nigeria, and studied a Canadian city, in this case, Vancouver, which were all mega cities on the coast and on river deltas, and tried to look at how do these various threats intersect and how can you bring communities together. And there was significant research came out of those kind of things, which we can get accessible to you. One of the areas we need to look at is how we can look at the cost benefit assessments and alternate decision frameworks that could, and how they might work in various ways to reduce the impacts, as well as looking at the non-monetary impacts and values. As we heard, unfortunately, that the moderator of this session was diagnosed with COVID. We are in a pandemic around the world, which is very sad and very, really impacting. But we can also try and take a more positive view in the sense that when we recover from COVID-19, where are there opportunities where, looking at various actions that can be taken, we can include in them the idea of building green, climate resilient communities as part of the strategy where investments are made to reduce the impacts of future climate change, as well as gaining the benefits. And there are some benefits of a changing climate. And as we all know, the climate is not changing uniformly around the world. When we talk about 1.5 degrees C, that really means in Canada, we're warming twice as fast, and the Arctic land regions are warming about 3 times as fast. So there are major changes in different places, and we need to look at how we can translate this information from one area to another. And the last comment I'll make is, in this particular issue, is the very importance of having integrated, let's say, information systems and warning systems that inform our citizens, our corporations, our local levels of government as to the likely occurrence. As I'm the ex-head of the former head of the Weather Service in Canada, and I used to say our job is to inform our citizens of future weather events that will happen today, tomorrow, the next week, the next month, the next century, and put them in not just saying words of science, but words of impacts that relate to people, so that we can communicate in ways that people understand. When you say there is a flood going to happen, what are the options that you can take depending on the time scale when that's going to occur. But the whole important thing of our scientific-based agencies within governments is to, as I say, do an integrated approach to add information on health impacts of these things as they might be happening. It's not just a flood that's going to wipe out a few buildings, but it also can affect the agricultural areas. It can affect people's health and those kind of things. So we need to provide that information in ways that is understandable to our community. So I'll stop talking there, and thank you very much again.
Tamam, tekrar size döneceğiz. Diğer konumuza geçelim. Bu arada katılımcılar bizlere sorularını iletebilirler. Panelimizin sonunda sorularınızı alacağız. Saat yaklaşık yarım saat sonra 18 civarında da sizlere sorular gelmeye başladı. Aktaracağız. Dünya, Sayın Stefan Holgate'e döneyim. Dünya Bankası'nın baş ekonomistlerinden biri olarak COVID-19 sonrası iyileşme döneminde yeşil aksiyonlar alınıyor. Yeşil büyüme için hükümetler çalışıyor. Kimisi az, kimisi daha çok, kurumlar çalışıyor, STK'lar çalışıyor. Pandeminin ardından bir bilinç oluştu. Dünyada bir döngüsel ekonomi var. Ayrıca yeşil ekonomi. Bunlar fazlasıyla konuşulmaya başlandı. Tabii bununla ilgili aksiyonlar da alınıyor. Siz nasıl görüyorsunuz gidişatı? Yeterli mi? Çünkü iklim krizini biz yaşıyoruz. Artık yarın deme şansımız yok. Değişikliğin bugünden yapılması lazım. Neler düşünüyorsunuz oradan bakınca dünyaya?
Yeah, thank you. This is a really important point. And, you know, we have been talking about the recovery from COVID for a long time, but I think we have to also accept that things will not be as clear as like a crisis and then it's over and there is a recovery. As you can see, I welcome you from the basement of my home because I'm still not in the office. So this crisis keeps going, and we have
Hiç Bodrum gibi gözükmüyor. Buyurun.
Thank you very much. But I think we have to move away from an idea that we have this short-term crisis and the long-term challenges. COVID-19 is becoming a long-term challenge too, and we really have to bring our thinking about short and long-term together. I think we have to recognize the terrible impact of COVID on the population. Many people have lost their jobs, they have lost their income, and it's of course a priority to help them. But as we do that, we should not forget about the longer term and the opportunities we have for that. Let me just give a few examples. In the context of a COVID, post-COVID crisis, creating jobs is of course the big priority. We want to help people keep their job and find new jobs. And I mentioned the success of Turkey in managing soil erosion, forestation, and landscape restoration. This is a typical example if you want to create many jobs for a population that might not be very skilled, but also wants to generate long-term benefits for agriculture and so on. This is one of those opportunities where there are synergy between the short and the long run. And we have all seen with a lot of concern the fires this summer and the floods in the country. Landscape management over the long run can also reduce floods, can also reduce those fires. And so we can see here how the various crises we're exposed to, COVID, but also natural disasters, can be managed in an integrated way if we look at landscapes and job creation together. Another example of cases where we have those synergies between jobs and resilience is the maintenance of infrastructure. You know, all countries in the world have a backlog of maintenance that is not done enough. Maintenance of roads, energy systems, water systems can create a lot of jobs. And this is something that you might want to do during a crisis because you have unemployed people that you can bring into this. Another example I wanted to flag of those synergies is the support to industries. So industries have been affected in many different and complex ways. Supply chains are affected. Governments have stepped in Turkey and elsewhere to help industries. The question is, which industries we want to help and how? And here I want to make the connection with your national development plan. Your national development plan in Turkey highlights a few industries which are priorities for the country in terms of exports and development. And you see the car industry, and here we want not only to help it, but also help it transform so that the Turkish car industry remains in global value chains for electric vehicles. And you have had some recent success on this. You build a lot of appliance And same thing, energy efficiency for appliance will become more and more important for your export markets. So maybe you can help that sector, but also help the sector transform into a more energy efficient sector. Same thing on steel, same thing on tourism and how to attract tourists that are looking for exceptional environment. And of course, you mentioned the circular economy, which is also an area where a lot of potential. I don't want to tell that to you because you know that better than I do, but for you, predictability is really important. You want to know the policy environment. You need to know what will happen in the future. And this is one of the role of all of those environmental treaty and all of those long-term commitments to make sure you as investors, are innovators, are creators, know in what context you operate so that you can make the right decisions. So I think there is a call for governments to give more visibility to the industries and the businesses so that we can make this transition as smooth as we can. So I'll stop here. I could also talk about energy security and how renewable energy can help provide cheap energy, but also an energy which is locally produced and robust.
Yeşil ekonomiden bahsettik de Türkiye bağlamında dünyaya baktığımızda gidişat nasıl? Yani hızlı geçen ülkeler var, daha geriden takip edenler var. Ne kadar bir sürede ekonominin dönüşmesi gerektiğini ya da dönüşebileceğini düşünüyorsunuz? Global manada soruyorum.
So I think that the transformation in the last 5 years in the world, but also in Turkey is really striking. And I think the fact that we have this discussion here is also showing how the needs to make that transition happen has become very mainstream. I think we all agree we need this transition to happen. And now we are discussing how to make it happen in the best possible way, which is a very different conversation than what we had a few, maybe a decade ago. I think there are also this change in the global context. And of course, I'm sure you're following very quickly what's happening in the European Union and the discussion about the Green Deal and the possibility of a carbon border adjustment mechanism, because for a country so connected to global value chain and global trade as Turkey, with its exceptional geographic location, which is really like an entry point for many different big markets, what happens in the world is very important to the choices that you're making every day. So I think we really have to move from a discussion about whether we want this transition to happen and to discuss how we make it happen and how we make it happen in a way that benefits the population with good jobs, economic growth, and good access to services. I think the more we collaborate globally and we avoid to have every country running in its own direction, the smoother the transition will be and the better the outcome for the populations. And I think it's really important that the countries move together. So being lagging on the rest of the world will be extremely damaging for any economy that cannot keep pace. So I would here call for work not only between governments, but also between Chamber of Commerce, between Chamber of Industries, so that the private sector can also agree on what is the most promising and how to collaborate and make the transition as easy as possible.
Tabii ki kesinlikle belediyeler, yerel yönetimler, hükümet, sivil toplum ve halk tamamının işbirliğiyle zaten ülkesel anlamda baktığımızda, ülkeler arasında global manada baktığımızda da tabii bütün hükümetlerin el birliğiyle olması gerekiyor. Yenilenebilir enerji ve enerjiden bahsedebilirim dediniz. Onu da bir daha size geldiğimde dilerseniz sorayım. Son kısımda o soruyu da ekleyelim size hemen. Diğer konuğuma dönelim. Gordon McBean, doğal afet ve iklim değişikliği açısından hükümetlerin alması gereken tedbirler neler olabilir? Daha önce siz biraz bahsettiniz. Kanada özelinde neler yaptığınızı. Orada tabii buzullara yakın olduğunuz için biraz daha yakinen de gördüğünüzü söylüyorsunuz. Tabii ki tüm dünya etkilerini yaşıyor iklim krizinin. Afet risk yönetimi konusunda yetkililerin, hükümetlerin alması gereken önlemler ne? En acil neler yapılması gerekiyor?
Well, thank you. I think the one thing is to, first of all, as Stefan talked about global collaboration, we can do this with our science communities as well to bring together the science programs in various countries. As I mentioned, the Future Earth program, there is the World Climate Research Program, and there's also one which is probably less well known, but very important, is the Integrated Research on Disaster Risk Program, which has set up a whole series of international centers of excellence. I think there's 16 or 17 of them around the world now that are working together and having the involvement of the Turkish scientific community and the Turkish, corporations through their research teams. It doesn't all have to be, and probably shouldn't be all just academic scientists. It needs to be scientists from all sectors of government, private sector, as well as academia, who are working together on this. But once we bring this together, but I think we need to then systematically look at things. And for the first step, I would say, is to assess through scientific analysis of the changing climate as to what will be the events that will happen in a given location. If we're talking about a particular community or government area, industry, what events were more likely to happen in the future that with more intensity, with more impact than happened in the past, to go through these things, both in the short term and longer term benefits, to see where the changes will take place. And then given that information, to then do a systematic assessment of basically the risk. So when we talk about risk in terms of disaster risk reduction, we talk about three things: the hazardous event, and I've mentioned those, but the other two are exposure and vulnerability. Exposure, if a particular factory is right next to a river, next to the ocean, or next to where a landslide could happen, you need to know about that vulnerability and exposure. What about the impacts of people? Where are the populations of people? Public infrastructure is very important, both from its fundamental point of view, because it is the electricity, power, and things that not only provide the services, but the capacity to respond to disasters when they happen. We've had cases around the world where, major event. We had an ice storm in Canada back around 1998, which basically closed down the city of Montreal and all those communities around it for more than a month, because the ice storm caused so much damage to the electric power systems. There was basically no electric power in all of those big cities for more than a month. And the impact of that was huge economically, but it was also very huge in terms of stress on people. There was mental health impacts on children and adults and all kinds of people that I guess I hadn't thought about it prior to this terrible event happening. But the medical people informed us about the issues that were happening due to the stress of these kind of events where your public infrastructure is basically destroyed and is not built properly so that it can survive a flood, a storm, a wildfire, etc. So we need to do those things to look at how we can take actions. We have projects at my university with the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction. We also have one of the largest wind engineering programs in the world at the university, looking at the physical structure. And one of the things that's been found in looking at tornadoes, is just to mention again, is that when tornadoes have happened in the past, and we had one, as I said earlier, only a few days ago, is the research team goes to the community where the tornado hit it and walks through and looks at various houses. And what you often see is one house that is totally devastated, destroyed fully. and the house too, maybe the next door house or one or two down from it, had almost no damage. So they've actually, as engineers, gone into these buildings to see, well, why did this one blow apart and this one not? And it's often due to the construction modes, the way in which they were built in detail. And so we need to look at our building codes and those kind of things to change them. And as Stefan also said, when we talk about responding from the pandemic, we should take actions to reconstruct some of the infrastructure in ways that it will actually be more resilient to extreme weather events in the coming future. One of the other areas, just to say, and going back to global collaboration, is the need for, and there's an international program on this called Adaptation Without Borders, in that you have to be very much aware that what you do in your country, particularly if you're working on a river, for example, if you do things so that the flood risk in your river is reduced, that could result in bigger risks of flood for the country which the river flows into next, or that kind of thing. And so that we need to cooperate internationally, both to ensure that what actions we take in one country don't impact negatively neighboring countries, and also to collaborate together in terms of the scientific and engineering, economic technologies, etc., that we can do to overall reduce the impacts of this changing climate. So in view of that and time, I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Tekrar döneceğiz size soru kısmında, çünkü sorular geliyor. Sayın Stefan Holgate'e dönelim. En son enerjiden bahsetmiştiniz. Yenilenebilir enerjiden, enerji kaynaklarından. Biz uzmanlarla konuştuğumuzda zaten tüm uzmanlar tamamıyla önümüzdeki yıllarda, hani çok da vakit geçmeden, kömürün tamamen kaldırılması ve yenilenebilir enerjiye dönüştürülmesi gerektiği söyleniyor uzmanlar tarafından. Doğal gazın da tamamen aslında kullanım dışı bırakılması gerektiği, ısınma sistemlerinin yenilenebilir enerjiyle sağlanması gerektiği belirtiliyor. Siz neler düşünüyorsunuz? Ne kadar sürede bu değişim mümkün olabilir? Çünkü vaktimiz de yok aslında. Bir an önce harekete geçilmesi lazım.
Thank you. So this is, of course, what's happening in the energy system, one of the key to stabilizing global climate change. And if you're looking at scenarios to do that, what is needed is for all of the carbon emissions to go to zero around, let's say, 2060, more or less. And in the scenarios that are doing that in a cost-efficient way, so the best way of achieving that, you see that the production of electricity in all of the scenarios and models tend to become zero carbon around 2040. So of course, in a context like that, if this is what needs to be achieved in all countries, building new coal power plants is an issue, because to achieve zero carbon electricity in 2040, it means that those coal power plants cannot stay online for their entire lifetime, which means that as an investment, it's very likely to create some financial problems if you have to retire them too early. The role of gas depends on the country and the strategy. If we're looking similarly at the scenarios, natural gas plays a role between now and 2040 to do the transition, because we cannot go to zero carbon overnight. This is something that will take a long time. Another dimension, again, is to look at the synergies with our other objectives. From a pure economic perspective, coal today is more expensive than renewables. So if we want to just minimize the costs of the power system, there are better options. But of course, renewables come with their own challenges. The fact that they change over time, and therefore you need the electricity system, the grid to be strengthened. You need storage with batteries for times when you don't have a lot of supply. And you need the demand for electricity to be much more adaptable if your supply is changing. So I think there is a very clear view that new coal power plants are not consistent with the objective of stabilizing climate change over the long run. And a lot of work about how to make that happen without hurting the people who are working in this industry. Very often it's not very rich people, so they need to be offered solutions. We can't just let them suffer the costs of a transition without support. And there are also a lot of recommendations in terms of how to manage an energy system with a lot of renewable. But in that, Turkey is already showing the example, because 50% of renewable in a system, there are very few countries at that level, which shows that this can be achieved. I also wanted to just stress one source of synergies in Turkey, which is the issue around natural disasters, and the fact that natural disasters in Turkey are not only climate related, but you have also this big challenge around earthquake and seismic risk. And we have seen that recently with the Izmir disaster, for instance. Buildings play a key role to save lives during earthquakes, but also a key role in terms of energy demand. And so choosing if heat in your buildings will be with electricity, gas, or coal will have a big impact on climate change. This is an area where you can find a lot of synergies for the country. And very simple calculations show that there is a potential to create 1 million good jobs in energy efficiency and retrofitting of buildings in the country. It's a $30 billion market for the country. So you can look at that as a cost and as a challenge. From the private sector perspective, you can also look at that as a massive opportunity to create jobs and generate income and profit. And I think it's really important to get this balance right, also looking at the opportunities that we have in those domains.
Teşekkür ediyorum. Dilerseniz bu noktada sorulara geçelim. Çünkü enerjiden bahsediyorsunuz. Enerjiyle ilgili bir soru geldi. İzleyicilerimizin soruları var. Onlardan birini ben size iletmek istiyorum Sayın Holgate. Nükleer enerji tesislerinin iklim krizine olan etkilerini değerlendirir misiniz diye bir konuğumuz sormuş.
So the role of nuclear energy is extremely debated, as you can imagine. And I think we have two different questions. One is, what about the climate impact of nuclear energy? And as you know, the functioning of a nuclear plant doesn't emit CO2. So it's a carbon-free source of electricity. Building a nuclear plant emits some CO2 because it uses a lot of concrete. It's a big project, but overall, nuclear is considered as a carbon-free source of energy. The other side of the equation is just the economics. With today, the cost of 1 kilowatt hour from a nuclear plant much more expensive than alternatives. So basically the question is on the trade-off between higher costs, but a nuclear plant doesn't have the viability of renewable energy. So this is the first discussion to have. And the second discussion to have, of course, is the cost versus all of the risks linked to nuclear energy. And people have in mind the risk of accident and so on. And we saw accident in the past, so we know it's possible. But I want also to flag all of the economic risks with some of the recent investment in nuclear plants overrunning the planned costs by a factor 3 or 4. So I think one of the value that we have to take into account of solar, wind, and other renewable technologies is the fact that they are like smaller projects with much lower risks because it's very diversified versus the big risk that you see in the nuclear industry. There is one other technology that I haven't mentioned, but it's carbon capture and storage. So this idea that you might be able to continue using fossil fuels, but to capture the carbon before it goes in the atmosphere and to put it back in the ground, which is also a technology we're talking about for decades and has been very slow in getting to market. So at the moment, it's a big uncertainty whether this technology will be available in the next decades or not. My last point on that is, at the moment, I think what's really needed is to think about the power system as a whole, look at the strengths and the weaknesses of all of the technologies, and try to build a diversified system that use all of the strengths of all of the various technologies. And when we do that, the big priorities we see for the future are really investing more in those small scale renewables like wind and solar with batteries, which today are very inexpensive. And also in terms of energy security, really great because everything is on your soil. You don't depend on imports for them.
Peki şunu da sorayım ben size, enerji bağlamında sanayiciler de bizi izlediği, dinlediği için dünyadaki dönüşümü nasıl görüyorsunuz? Yani sanayi hangi enerji, neyi kullanmaya devam ediyor? Nasıl bir dönüşüme doğru gidiyor? Ne yapılmalı? Bunu da yanıtlarsanız seviniriz. Sanayicilere yön göstermek açısından.
So I think we have to separate small industries manufacturing, which is clearly going to use more and more electricity. And since this electricity will be zero carbon, that kind of like solves our problem. And big industries, heavy industries, where we have major challenges because either we're using very high temperatures and electricity is not great to use very high temperatures, or it's the process itself. Like when you do cement, the process of doing cement is emitting carbon. At the same time, we see really interesting innovation at the moment. For very high temperatures, there is this use of hydrogen, which I'm sure a lot of you in the audience have been looking into it because it has been a priority. In many countries, we see hydrogen development roadmaps with a lot of investments in China, in the European Union, in the US. And of course, if it becomes an important technology, Turkey will have to be part of that wave. It would be very damaging to be left out. The beauty of that solution to the heavy industry problem is that it largely solves also the question of how to manage the viability in solar and wind energy. Because if you have hydrogen, you can create hydrogen when you have too much sun and too much wind, and to use it when you don't have enough sun and enough wind. But of course, today, hydrogen is an expensive technology. So this is really something which is in between research and development and pilot projects. We also see a lot of movement in steel and in cement. You might have seen that Volvo and BMW have started to make commitments to use zero carbon steel in their cars. So they are moving to electric vehicles. So they changed the engine to be zero carbon, and now they changed the body to be zero carbon. And of course, as a country well integrated into the car making value chain, I think this is something that Turkey should be following extremely closely. On electric cars, you have already a major investment plan for a big factory in the country. So I think you're staying really at the front line on that. But all of the other sectors will also have to make that shift.
Burada bir konumuz onunla bağlantılı olarak enerjiden bahsederken daha çok pillerden, depolamadan bahsettiniz. Hidroenerji de var, o şekilde de depolanıyor demiş. Zaten buna bir miktar yanıt vermiş oldunuz sanırım. Eklemek istediğiniz varsa eğer.
No, maybe if we mention, so hydropower is critical globally and in Turkey, of course. I think this is one of these domains where we cannot separate adaptation to climate change and reduction of emissions, because one of the questions is how will changes in climate and rainfall will affect the ability of hydropower to generate electricity. There are contrasted scenarios for Turkey, but it doesn't seem to be a major short-term risk, but that's really something to keep an eye on and to take into account. I was saying that you want to diversify your energy sources. I think this is a good example. You don't want to be vulnerable to any one thing going really bad that you wouldn't have predicted. And it can be in terms of imports, it can be in terms of weather, it can be in terms of technologies. At the World Bank, we're working very much on what we call robust decision-making. It's this idea that we acknowledge we cannot predict the future. Everybody tries, everybody fails. So we agree that we won't be able to do forecasts for the future. So when we make decision, we want to make sure our decision would not lead to catastrophes if anything is surprising or if there is one thing that we haven't seen coming. So this notion that you need to stress test your decision making to make sure what you're doing is good in the right range of possible future, I think is a very important idea, which is relatively common in long-term planning in government. I think the private sector is catching up on those approaches to make robust decision making, but that's I think an important point to mention.
Teşekkür ediyorum. Bu noktada diğer konuğuma dönüyorum. Profesör Gordon McBean, Kanada Western Üniversitesi Öğretim Üyesi. Özgür Bey bir soru sormuş. Konuğumuz güzel bir soru sormuş. İklim değişikliği fiilen her insana dokunur hale gelmiştir. Tabii tüm dünyada böyle. Ancak bu gerçekliğin yerel, bölgesel, ulusal ve küresel siyasi politik öncelikler arasında yer almadığı izlenimde son derece güçlüdür. Yaşamın siyasi çıkarlar ötesinde bir durum olduğu nasıl anlatılabilir? Evet, iklim krizi, ben de ufak bir ekleme yapayım. İklim krizi önceliğimiz ama tüm dünyada baktığımızda tabii ülkelere göre değişiyor ama siyasi gündemler çok daha ön planda hala tutulabiliyor. Baktığımızda pandeminin ardından iklim krizi daha ön plana çıktı ama yine de net adımlar atılamayabiliyor. Yaşamın siyasi çıkarlar ötesinde olduğu bir durum bu ve bu nasıl anlatılabilir demiş.
I'm sorry, my Wi-Fi disconnected. I'm now back on again, so I missed what the question was.
Tamam, tabii ki. Tabii ki.
Back on
Şu anda görüntünüz dondu gibi biraz. İklim değişikliği, ben aslında aynı soruyu Sayın Hallegatte'e de soracaktım. Dilerseniz görüntü donarsa sizinle başlayayım Sayın Hallegate. Sanırım geldi şu anda. Soruyu tekrar ediyorum hemen. İklim değişikliği fiilen her insana dokunur hale gelmiştir. Ancak hala ülkelerde siyasi politik öncelikler daha öncedir. İklim değişikliği bu öncelikler arasında hala yer almıyor izlenim var diyor. Yaşam siyasi çıkarlar ötesinde bir durumdur. Bunu nasıl anlatabiliriz, nasıl önceliğimiz haline getirebiliriz diyor.
Well, I think we've hopefully been able to improve this situation a little bit in that I've been working on climate change since the 1970s and the 80s, and we got no response action in those days. We now get response action due to the unfortunately the impacts, but also the young people involved, the marching of things, climate activities. And one of the things we still have to worry about is what is basically called fake science. There is still people who are denying climate change is actually due to humans. It's whereas in the reality is that, well, the scientific evidence is very strong. We are starting to see much more action nationally and internationally from what I've seen around the world. More countries are starting to take action, and I think one of the things just let me say that I'm very impressed the fact that the Istanbul Chamber of Industry is having this session on climate action, and there's over 100. Well, there was actually at one point 180 people participating in this, and I think that's a very strong indication of the increasing role that the private sector, industry sectors see as their role in taking action on climate change. And as Stefan has talked about, some of the economic and social benefits of taking action now that will generate profits in the future, but also a greener economy that is better for all. So I think I'm, let's say, more optimistic and more that things are going to start happening compared to what I was even only a few years ago. So I think I'll stop there before I lose my connection again. Thank you.
Sizler soruları cevapladıkça sorular da gelmeye devam ediyor artarak. Sayın Hallegate, soruya sizin eklemek istediğiniz cevap var mı acaba?
Just maybe one point that when I talk about climate change, I get a lot of questions on the balance between individual action, what people can do in their home, in their own choices, and what needs to be a political decision. And I think in a sense, it's a wrong distinction, because the big societal change that requires a lot of political will and a lot of political action and big policy changes will happen only if people support that change, and people will support that change only if in their own life they are also making their part. So I think we should really present that as moving together, and not so much at which one is more important, because there is a constant back and forth between people making their own choices in their own life and the way society, governments, cities, local authorities, civil associations, business associations, all of those choices will have to change together. So, and they reinforce each other. So everything in any of those directions, I think is good. And the hope, and that was the hope also in the spirit of the Paris Agreement, is that we'll get this loop where things reinforce themselves until we manage this transition.
Teşekkür ediyoruz. Umut çok önemli bir kelimenin altını çizdiniz. Her alanda umutlu olmak zorundayız zaten. Sayın Stefani, size Hallegate'de soru gelmiş. Şöyle diyor bir izleyicimiz: Çin, Amerika Birleşik Devletleri, Hindistan, Rusya gibi ülkeleri topladığımızda dünyadaki karbon emisyonunun yaklaşık %55'ini onlar sağlıyor. Türkiye sadece %1 demiş. Türkiye'nin çabaları bu karbon emisyonunu ne kadar değiştirecek ki, durumu iyileştirmeyecektir demiş. Sizin yorumunuz ne demiş? Ben bir şey ekleyerek size döneyim. Tabii %1 değiştirmeyecek diye düşünmemek lazım öncelikle. Bu bakış açısını aslında belki de değiştirmek lazım. Çünkü bireyden başlayarak hepimizin çabası burada çok önemli. %1, %5, %1 hiç fark etmez. Hepimizin çabası önemlidir. Tabii kıyaslama yapmak açısından siz neler diyeceksiniz?
I would agree with you very much. I mean, at the end of the day, we are all 0% of the problem. If you're thinking about Bill Gates is 0% of the problem, but it doesn't mean that he doesn't have to do his part, right? New York City is 0.3% of global emissions, but it's the richest city in the world. They are small, but they probably need to play their role. So I think there is this idea that we all agree that getting to zero emission means that we need collective action, where the big and the small will have to play their role. But here I want also to stress another thing. Today, the US, the EU, China, South Korea, Brazil, all of those countries have made a commitment to be net zero in 2050 or 2060. So I think there is a question of, if all of these big players are going zero carbon, which means that a lot of the major consumer markets will be zero carbon, but also most of the global innovation will take place in zero carbon countries. It's in the interest of all countries to be in that wave. It's a little bit difficult to imagine how, if all of these big countries get to zero carbon, how possible it is to be a high income country, which all countries aspire to be, with technologies of the 20th century instead of the technologies of the 21st century. international investments, trade, being part of the global value chains, all of that is important for growth. It's important for jobs. It's important for innovation. Today, there is a question of, is it possible to be in that global growth if you're not part of this decarbonization process? So I think we have to look at how climate action contributes to the climate change challenge. But I think all countries, even the smallest, and I'm working in Caribbean countries, there are zero emission in those countries, but they still think about what decarbonization means for them because they don't want to be left out if the world is moving. They want to move with the world. And this self-interested view on climate action is very important. We need to think, what do I have for me and for my industry, for my company in being part of this decarbonization? And also, what are the risks? And what can I do to make sure at the end of that story, I end up on the right side of this transition as a winner of the transition and not as a stranded asset.
Sorular daha çok sizin alanınıza yönelik geliyor Sayın Hallegate. Ben sizinle devam etmek durumundayım. McBean'e de az sonra sorular geldiği takdirde döneceğim.
Bu arada çok pardon sözünüzü keseceğim.
Buyurun,
ben başka toplantıya yetişebilmek için aranızdan ayrılmak mecburiyetindeyim. Hem size hem de çok değerli uzaklardan aramızda bulunan katılımcılara çok teşekkür ediyorum. Umarım ki ileriki günlerde daha yeşil, daha sorunları çözmüş bir dünya üzerinde buluşabiliriz. Tekrar sevgilerle, teşekkürlerimle iyi toplantılar diliyorum.
Çok teşekkürler Sayın Başkan katılımınız için. İSO Yönetim Kurulu Başkanı Sayın Erdal Bahçıvan açılış konuşmasını gerçekleştirmişti. Tüm toplantılarda olduğu gibi sonuna kadar toplantıyı takip etmeye çalışıyor. Ancak bu sefer bir toplantı nedeniyle ayrılması gerektiğini bizlere iletti. Zaten biz de tamamlamak üzerindeyiz. Son 10-15 dakika kaldı. Kendisine ve İstanbul Sanayi Odası'na da sürdürülebilirlik vizyonu için biz teşekkür ediyoruz. Sayın Hallegate, sizin anlattığınızla ilgili hemen tamamlayalım. Gelişmiş ülkeler dünyayı bu bağlamda karbon emisyonundan bahsedince dünyayı kirlettiler ve iklim değişikliğine sebep olmaya da devam ediyorlar diyor. Yine karbon salınımı en yüksek ülkelerde bu süper güçler deniliyor. Kontrol altına alınması ve tutulması için iklim değişikliği senaryolarının küresel bir proje olduğu iddiaları demiş ama net bir yanıt verilebilir mi bilmiyorum.
So, I mean, the question of how the world organizes itself to fix a global challenge is very much work in progress. And I mean, we see that for climate, but we also see that for COVID-19, where collaboration has been improving over time, but we realize today that there is a lot of work to do so that next time there is a big global threat on the world, we can get much better organized much earlier, better share information and better decide. So I think this question is not a question only for climate. I think it's a question for managing the global economy and the global ecosystem. The way the climate discussion at the global scale has been managed started from this idea that we would be able to coordinate very closely between countries, but it did not work really well. So with the Paris Agreement, there is this shift to a different philosophy where every country is bringing to the table what we call nationally determined contributions. So every country tells the world what the country is planning to do to contribute to solving the climate change challenge. And because those nationally determined contributions are revised every 5 years, we hope, and I'll come back to the hope, that as countries see the others moving, you will see more and more action, and every country will be confident that because the others are moving, there is an interest to move too, and that we could have this soft coordination toward more and more ambition and solve that problem. So I think instead of thinking about how do my contribution compare with other contribution, I think the idea is to ask people to look at what they can contribute. And I hope I make the case that there are a lot of things that every country can contribute to that is also good for economic growth and income and jobs and poverty reduction. So we can also contribute without sacrificing anything. And if we are all countries are trying to put on the table what they can contribute, then we can look at what it does at the global if we add everything up and discuss how we close the gap. And I think this is what's happening at the moment with the contributions getting more and more ambitious. Remember, 10 years ago, the scenarios were talking about warming by 4 degrees in 2100. Today, if you believe all of the commitments, we have reduced that from 4 degrees to 2.4. Maybe it's not enough, but what a success and what a rapid change compared with 10 years ago. So my take on that is it's not so much about sharing a burden. It's about contributing to a global challenge and making sure everybody contributes. And I agree with, I guess the question is also about countries who would not be playing that game and contributing. But the hope is that this issue will not happen because just global supply chains will basically make it in the interest of all countries to play their part.
Kesinlikle çok teşekkürler. Diğer ülkelerle kıyaslamak değil, biz ne yapabiliriz bunu düşünmek lazım. Elimizden gelenin en iyisini yapmak hepimiz için sorumluluk, milli bir sorumluluk aslında. Tabii tüm son kertede baktığımızda da global bir sorumluluk hepimiz için. Size tekrar geleceğim. Biraz daha vaktimiz var, bir 10 dakikamız. Son soruları da ileteceğim. Sayın McBean'e dönersem, İklim değişikliğinin zararlarını önlemek için sadece fosil yakıtlar değil, her türlü aşırı tüketimin azaltılması gerekirse, büyüme hedefleriyle dünyayı korumak arasında denge nasıl kurulabilir demiş. Bir yandan büyümek istiyoruz tabii, büyümek için de enerji harcamak gerekiyor. Fosil yakıtları bir yandan azaltmamız lazım. Dünyayı korumak arasında işte bu denge tüm dünyanın aslında yapmaya çalıştığı, nasıl dengeyi sağlayabiliriz diye sormuşlar. Buyurun lütfen.
Well, there are a number of ways, and thank you for the question, but there are a number of ways that we can do these kind of things, and Stefan has spoken about some of them, but I think there are ways in which we can rechange our supply systems, both within countries and otherwise. And well, since Stefan noted earlier that he is working at home, I'm also working at home, and if you look up behind me, there's pictures of my grandson who's an engineer and my daughter who's a chemical engineer. And interestingly, the factory that she's a chemical engineer in actually takes all old paper of any kind and recycles it to make it into molded fiber cartons that put eggs and other products in them so that they have reduced the, let's say, the consumption of energy in that way and the use of products that are not running. And we need really just think, since systematically they're there, that we need to think about how we're doing this for our children and grandchildren around the world and find ways to, as was also talked about, have diversified systems that bring things together that are more robust in the sense that if one of them fails, the others don't. But also, since you mentioned the global supply chains at the end there, it's, I think, going to be important in terms of the carbon situation to not only have carbon taxes, carbon agreements that deal with our own national thing, but what are the, let's say, the carbon embedded in the supply chains that we work internationally. And this is where we need to work on a global basis to address these issues so that we don't have the transfer of basically energy consumption systems from one to another in ways that actually don't really have the net overall benefits for the climate system. So I think there needs to be these transformations around the world to address these issues. So thank you very much.
Teşekkürler Sayın Hallegatte'e ben döneceğim yine. İskoçya'da Kasım ayında yapılacak 26. Birleşmiş Milletler'in İklim Değişikliği Konferansı var. Soru bununla ilgili. Türkiye'nin Paris Anlaşması'nı imzalayacağını düşünüyor musunuz demiş. Tabii oradan bakış açısı nasıl yanıtlayabileceğiniz bir soru mu bilmiyorum. Düşünüyor musunuz, sizin bakış açınız ne demiş. Devamında da AB İklim Sosyal Fonu gibi fonlardan ülkemiz sanayisinin yararlanma imkanı var mı? COP26'da Türkiye'nin iklim fonundan pay alması mümkün olacak mı demiş. Tabii genel çerçeveyle belki yanıtlamak istersiniz. Buyurun.
So, I mean, this question, speaking from the World Bank, we're not party of the climate negotiations, and the choice of joining an international agreement like that is a country's choice made by its government. So I wouldn't make any advice or prediction on that. It's clearly what the government needs to decide on behalf of the country. What we have been trying to do is to focus on climate action, and of course, being part of the agreement changes some of the context in which that take place. But I want to really emphasize that a lot of the action that we're talking about do make sense for the development of Turkey anyway. So I think it's important to separate the questions of the international landscape and those big agreements versus a development path for the country so that it's sustainable and it benefits from the best and latest technologies. Those are two questions that can be discussed separately.
Bir soru daha var, yanıtlama. Plastik atıklarla ilgili, plastik atıkların geri dönüştürülmesi sırasında ortaya çıkan karbon salınımına yönelik stratejiler nelerdir? Plastik atığı çünkü dönüştürürken de karbon çıkıyor. Tabii onun da dönüşümü önemli. Nasıl, kim yanıt vermek isterse buyurun lütfen. Böyle de tamamlayalım ardından.
So you have to say when you're not an expert, and I'm not an expert in the recycling of plastic. What I know...
Biliyorum, bu alanlarda çalıştığınız için sadece bakış açısı olarak farkındayım ben de. Yanıtlamak isterseniz, dilerseniz diye yönelttim.
No, yes, I was going there in the sense that if you're thinking about the circular economy, which is an economy that doesn't produce waste, but everything is the input of another process, we're thinking a lot about the recycling part of a circular economy, and it's a really important one. But there is another dimension, which is the fact that, as you very rightly point out, some products are very difficult to recycle. Sometimes it's expensive, sometimes it consumes a lot of energy, sometimes it creates some side waste. And in those cases, a circular economy might not be so much about recycling, but more about not using in the first place. So I think for a lot of the plastic challenge, there is a huge potential in not using plastic when it can be avoided, and using plastic more for multiple use purposes and not so much for single use purposes. And there are also a link with more generally the question of waste, solid waste management, which is a major challenge everywhere in the world. The amount of solid waste that we have to manage is growing very, very fast. And the costs are increasing very, very fast. There is a massive economic opportunity in trying to be more efficient. And again, I'm talking about economic growth. I'm talking about efficiency here, by producing less things that will just end up being waste. Economic growth is about using our resources more efficiently. Reducing waste is not an environmental policy. It's really a growth policy because it's an efficiency policy. But we should not overlook all of the prevention of waste creation. It's not only about recycling, it's also about avoiding.
Sayın McBean, eklemek istedikleriniz var mı? Çok teşekkür ediyorum size Sayın Hallegate. Son eklemek istedikleriniz varsa onları da alayım. Kapatalım yayınımızı.
Well, just a very quick comment to first of all say thank you all very much for inviting me, and particularly for the comments and questions. The discussion has been for me very helpful and quite frankly encouraging, strongly encouraging, the fact that there is so much interest in this action here within this organization. And I'd just like to say that one of the other groups I often talk to is the food science and technology area. And just following Stefan's comment, the amount of food we produce globally is huge. And apparently 30–40% of it is never really used. And that's a case of where we need to take actions to better distribute it, be more effective, and not just generate stuff which isn't used. So thank you very much all, and thank you. And I look forward to further interactions over the years to come. Thank you.
Biz teşekkür ediyoruz verdiğiniz çok değerli bilgiler için. Sayın Hallegate, sizin de son eklemek istedikleriniz varsa son bir mesajınız alabilirim.
Just joining Gordon in thanking you for the organization, repeating that the World Bank has always been a very strong partner of Turkey on those issues, and we're really standing ready to help the country with bringing some international experience, bringing some advice, helping convene. There are many ways, but of course, we're here to support the decisions of the Turkish government and the initiatives of the private sector in the country, and we're very happy to do so. So I hope this conversation was useful for you. It was certainly useful for me, and I look forward to more interactions with you and the other stakeholders in the country. Thank you.
Çok teşekkür ediyorum. Bizler için de çok değerli, çok kıymetli verdiğiniz bilgiler. Profesör Gordon McBean, Klimatolog, Kanada Western Üniversitesi Öğretim Üyesi ve Sayın Stefan Hallegate, Dünya Bankası İklim Değişikliği Grubu Baş Ekonomisi. Hem sorularımızı yanıtladılar, ardından sizin izleyicilerimizin sorularını da yanıtladılar. Tabii çok önemli noktalara dikkat çektiler. Aslında ötekisi başkası diğeri dememek lazım. Bizden, benden başlamak lazım. Hepimizin yapabilecekleri var. Az önce son kapanışta Mr. McBean'in de dediği gibi verimlilik çok önemli. Her iki konuğum da vurguladı özellikle. Gıdaların örneğin %40'ı çöpe gidiyor. Yani bir yandan biz dönüştürmeyi düşünürken onun öncesinde mutlaka ama mutlaka daha az tüketmeliyiz. Bilinçli tüketici olmalıyız. Her iki konuğumuzun da vurguladığı gibi verimlilik çok önemli. Özellikle değişen dünyada, döngüsel ekonomide, yeşil ekonomiye geçişte hem daha az tüketmek, tükettiklerimizin de dönüşümünü sağlayabilmek, en az atığı çıkarmak önemli, onu da dönüştürebilmek zaten. Verdikleri bilgiler bizler için de çok değerli, çok kıymetli, sizler için de faydası olduğunu düşünüyoruz. İstanbul Sanayi Odası'na teşekkür ediyoruz. Yeşil Gündem Sohbetlerinin ikincisiydi bu. İklim krizine küresel bakış ve krizleri yönetmek başlığı altında konuştuk. İstanbul Sanayi Odası Yönetim Kurulu Başkanı Sayın Erdal Bahçıvan'ın açılış konuşmasıyla başladık. Hepinize çok teşekkür ediyorum. Görüşmek üzere, hoşça kalın.